right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us wherever you're tuning in from. I see we have some folks joining us from the land of Wisconsin, as well as Arkansas, the UK, and Arizona. So welcome, folks. Thanks again for joining us for 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. As Doctors of .NET, we prescribe you healthy choices in ‘NET. I am your host, Luis Quintanilla, and with me are my co-hosts, Scott Addy and... Is that the right one?
Nope.
There we go. Yeah. Cam Soper. I always forget which way it goes. So we're going to be talking about microfrontends in Blazor today with Flo, who's going to be joining us and talking to us a little bit about that. So Flo, would you like to give a really quick introduction?
Yeah, thanks. Hello, I'm Florian Rappl from Munich, Germany. I'm a solution architect at a smaller company called Smapiot. And yeah, we are doing IT consulting. And I'm a Microsoft MVP in the development area since almost 10 years now. So quite a long time.
Awesome. Yeah. And Blazor, believe it or not, has been around for quite some time as well. So not quite 10 years, but it's been around for a while. But before we get started, how about we get into some docs to see how folks can get started with Blazor.
All right, it's time for the checkup. The doctor says so. What you're seeing here on my screen is just a small portion of this Blazor Components topic for ASP.NET Core Blazor applications. So if you've come from a background in ASP.NET proper or ASP.NET Core, where you're using MVC or Razor pages, the concept I'm going to talk to you about will feel very familiar. What a Blazor component is you can think of it as a self-contained, reusable, nestable UI component, and it's useful for those situations where you have some logic that needs to run to generate UI elements. You would write these in C#, HTML, and Razor, and these are things that this markup section of this larger doc will talk to you about. Blazor components have this .razor file extension, which is unique because if you've come from that MVC Razor pages background, you're used to the .cshtml file extension. It's .razor in the Blazor space. As I mentioned, you can include rendering logic in Blazor components. The way you would do this is to use this @code directive. I'll show you an example here to help clarify, but here in this markup, I've highlighted what I'm talking about. @code is your opportunity to add some C# code for rendering logic. As an alternative to embedding it in the same Razor file with the markup, you can actually move this to an external class file. It's totally up to you how you want to approach that. This code directive is also the place where you would handle any custom lifecycle events such as clicks. You can also handle the built-in component lifecycle events that Blazor provides to you. An example of that is the onInitialized event. If you come from a web forms background, think of it sort of like the page load, page pre-render, that lifecycle. We have a similar lifecycle here for Blazor components. The other thing I'll point out here is these Blazor components are regenerated in response to events. Specifically, the new render tree is compared against the previous or old render tree. And it's that diff between those two render trees that will ultimately determine which DOM updates are applied in the browser in your app. We look back up, one other thing I'll point out here in this very simplistic example of this Blazor component. You see we have two fields. One is specifying the way in which we want to emphasize this H1 header. In this case, we're going to italicize that font. Second thing we're going to do is provide the heading text. This is pretty boring. Admittedly, you can take this to the next level by parameterizing things like properties within this code block. And that allows the consumer then to specify what those values are that are used within the component.
Scott, I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
So I noticed that the code directive comes after the H1, but the H1, the attributes, well, the the heading text contained within the H1 element, those are all defined after the H1. So I guess order isn't important there.
In this case, order is not important. Those fields are still in scope. It has to do with the way that this component is compiled.
Ah, gotcha.
So great question. By the way, did we display the URL for this in case folks are interested?
We sure did, but we'll throw it up there again.
Awesome. So bottom of your screen, if anything I talked about today interests you, check it out. Let's roll into the hallway track. All right. Hallway track. Here we are. Right away, I see questions in the chat. We'll get to those shortly. But for folks in the chat, please keep those questions coming. Why don't we toss it over to Flo? And Flo, let's just get a brief description of what we'll talk about today so we can kind of set expectations for the audience.
Sure. So what I want to talk about today is microfrontends in general and microfrontends in Blazor in particular, right? So what are microfrontends? Microfrontends are just an architectural style that is, let's say, up and coming in the recent 2 or 3 years. And they provide, let's say, similar benefits to what microservices did to the backend, now to the front end, hence the front end in the name. Of course, we should see how that may look like in Blazor, what could be difficulties implementing them in Blazor. And yeah, just, let's say, also going over the questions from the audience, what they might think of, where they already maybe used microfrontends, and yeah, where they struggle with.
So when you say that it's like it does for front ends, like what microservices does for backends, can you tell us more about that? Because I know a little bit about microservices. I don't know much about front ends, though.
Yeah. So what microservices brought to the table is that it, well, enabled different independent teams to develop code independently and to ship autonomously, so to speak, which, of course, was advertised as being then a lot faster, right? There were then a lot of side effects, some, of course, negative, like you had to do some orchestration and so on in the backend. There are, of course, always two sides of a coin. But on the other side, you had positive side effects too, like, for instance, freedom in technology choice. So if you had a team that only, I don't know, knew how to build fast and performant APIs with Rust, this team could, well, write the APIs in Rust. And then you had another team writing C# and being happy there, so they could just deploy their service in C#. Now, of course, it doesn't mean every team needs to use their own tech stack. I mean, that also can be very deadly for any project. But nevertheless, it's something that you could do. And of course, as microfrontends, it's a little bit similar, right? So here you also want to enable different independent teams to, well, develop side by side, ship features independently, still have one UI that needs to be consistent, which is here the one big challenge, right? But then still, you may also want to give them some freedom in technology choice. Of course, the biggest choice would be what kind of front-end framework do you use? Our advice here is usually don't overdo it, because in the backend, I mean, you had different boxes, right? So you had a lot of computing power potentially, but on the front end, you may have just a mobile phone or something. So if you really then run for, I don't know, just a small single page application that isn't really so special, suddenly 7 different front-end frameworks may not be ideal, right? But in the end, still, different teams can choose the different tech stack. And even though the front-end framework may be, let's say, nice, but it shouldn't be done, there may be other things too, like a dev tech stack. So one team uses TypeScript, another uses Flow, another uses just vanilla JavaScript, and that's then possible too, right? And without much conflict, and every team just responsible for their own tool chain. And I guess this is what most people look into. What we are usually looking more into is really the feature aspect of it, that you can really now, using microfrontends, ship features faster, iterate faster, but that again has always two sides, but just as a glimpse of it.
So with this micro front end approach, do you run into the risk of creating a framework of frameworks, sort of your own Frankenstein invention. Is there a risk like that?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, in general, with pretty much everything, technology, there's this risk on the not invented here syndrome, for instance, or especially when we're talking about, you know, bringing different things together and someone needs to do an orchestration layer to come up with a kind of framework of frameworks or meta frameworks. Luckily, there are already solutions out there, right? And you can fall back on them. Some of these solutions, they want especially to help you develop your framework of frameworks. Others, they try to really, let's say, have everything already figured out for you. That whatever you choose, I mean, you should, of course, be aligned with your team and your problem that you want to solve. And in the end, I mean, what we always advise is, and it should be said already early on, a good monolith cannot be beaten, right? So if your solution is really simple, or if your problem, I mean, is really small, then your solution shouldn't be that difficult, right? And if you have a good, well-architectured monolith, you can always restructure it and migrate. That was always with the backend also the case, right? So there was never the need to already start with microservices and say, oh, okay, now I want to see how that goes, and I first need to set up Kubernetes and all that, and I don't know, 3 months later, you were ready to deploy your first service. No, just get something out there, and then you can always, if that's already well done, restructure it really easily. But yeah, I mean, don't make things difficult in the beginning. It's just a tool, like everything. It's a tool that can help you if you have a certain kind of problem to tackle, but it's not the answer to everything, certainly.
So speaking of monoliths and in terms of project structure, so then would microfrontends be similar to microservices, where perhaps you might have separate repos for each of these components or pieces of your UI? Or how are these projects typically structured?
Mm-hmm. There are several ways to tackle it. What we usually advocate is the approach that you just mentioned with dedicated repositories. What's also very popular, especially in the front-end space, is a monorepo. There, of course, what you can question is the independence of these teams. What usually is very simple in a monorepo is, for instance, debugging, right? Because you have anyway also the code from other teams in there. And so starting a joint debugging session is really, really easy. Also for things like I just mentioned, the consistency of a UI, I mean, that as well is very easy to uphold in a monorepo. If you go now to the distributed repository approach, what we usually advocate, and we have a framework for that, it's called Pyral, is an approach that is very similar to what you would do on, let's say, a mobile app development. So what you would get is a kind of an emulator. So the emulator is, in the mobile space, your operating system, like Android, iOS, for instance, Windows Phone back in the days. And then, of course, your app runs in this emulator when you, let's say, develop it. And the same approach could be done with a microfrontend approach. So you develop your microfrontend, and it now runs in this emulator, which is just an empty shell representing your front-end application, right? So no other microfrontend in there, unless you explicitly drag it in there and say, oh, for debugging my thing, for developing my microfrontend, I need this other microfrontend. You can just drag it in. And this approach usually scales quite well. The problem is of course, like with the emulator back in the day in iOS, you need to, let's say, maintain that too as a developer, right? So you need to update it on your local machine and so on and so forth. But that works very well. There are, of course, other approaches. Some have dedicated staging environments online, and you can only debug it online and need to fiddle there in the browser debug tools. Yeah, that, of course, can work. Has, of course, the drawback that it doesn't work offline, and yeah, also needs to be set up, and you have a dedicated environment for that. So yeah, some overhead there too.
So listening to you talk there, I have a lot more questions now, but I'm wondering, should we get to maybe a demo and let the questions flow from there? I see all sorts of chatter here about how do you enforce consistent styling, and do you need one database for the entire app or separate DBs? So maybe what we'll do is let's just start with a demo and go from there.
Demo. I don't want to start now with what we see on the screen. That is maybe for later when we also enter the Blazor space. Let's just do something we all maybe know, Netflix. I'm not claiming now that Netflix was built in a microfrontend architecture. Maybe it was. We only know, of course, the backend since microservice popularity gained, let's say, a lot of attraction through Netflix. Nevertheless, so what we see here is, let's say, a clone of Netflix's UI. Yeah, I mean, works pretty well. You have a search. I don't know. Does it work? Yeah. So you get some results here, and we also have a profile picker. I don't know. So here are some funny images. So you could, for instance, change to John here. And yeah, of course, we see a little bit of a preview image and a lot of, let's say, movies we could now watch. We can even click it, make it a favorite, go back to our favorite page, and there we see what we just selected. Select something else, can go here. Now we got 2 of them. Pretty straightforward so far. I mean, again, it's just a demo. There is no real player in there, so we will just see a video never gonna give you up. But,
all right. So I just want to pause just for a moment to recognize that is the first time we have been rickrolled on this program. Congratulations on yeah.
I think it just hit 1 billion views like a month ago or so. So yeah.
For situations like that, we need an air horn sound effect because that was awesome.
I mean, all credits for this demo goes to one of our interns from, let's say, early this year. So Dante De Ruve, he was a great guy. He's still a great guy. We will also talk about his work, I guess, later, because he did a lot of other things in the Blazor space for Microfrontends too. But nevertheless, so he did that demo. And I think it's a good demo because, yeah, Netflix is something anyone can attach to. And as we will see in a second, there is, of course, this microfrontend character. Because all the elements of this page are coming from different microfrontends. When this page loads, it's a single-page application, so everything is driven by JavaScript, essentially. There is an XHR request going through the network, and this one will result in the following JSON, which delivers a list of items. These items are microfrontends. What we see here is that we got 5 microfrontends. One is called Browse, another one is called Favorites, Profile, Search, and Watch. And as you guess already from these names, each one is covering a certain domain of this application, right? So one is specialized in bringing things for watching, another is specialized in the search, another one just brings your profile feature.
So I want to ask you something real quick, and just because I want to make it really clear for our viewers. So this app that we're looking at right here is a mock-up of the Netflix website that your intern redid in this micro front ends style that you're demoing, and you're like, okay, so if we built the Netflix website, this is how we would have done it.
Potentially we would have done it that way, yeah, because Netflix is a real tool website, so it's a single page application by definition. You require JavaScript. Potentially also there are various areas that you want. I mean, you have, of course, your core areas, watching a movie, but then you have certain side areas that shouldn't, let's say, impact any release, right? So I mean, maybe you want to have some recommendations in there, but yeah, I mean, that shouldn't block a release that you want to do, right? So maybe that's a side feature that a dedicated team could do. And so in my opinion, as the backend was, the front end from Netflix is also an ideal candidate to be solved by microfrontends. Yeah, I potentially would have chosen that.
So, excellent demo example, because like you said earlier, we all know Netflix. Well, I won't say we all know Netflix, but Netflix is very familiar to a lot of people.
Right. And I mean, another good example would, for instance, be the Azure portal, right? Because there, you have these different features which are potentially even owned now by full stack teams. So you could say the team that's developing the service that's going live on Azure should maybe also bring the front end into the Azure portal, and they should be able to do that independently, right? So should also not be impacted by any other team doing, and I mean, as far as I know, but you tell me, the Azure portal was developed in such a style already, right? So that you can actually have independent releases of these features. You can have preview features and so on and so forth. So all of that is also possible there. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a good choice.
I don't know the details, but yeah, it's a pretty safe bet that that's how it was developed.
Yeah, I mean, of course, using back in the day older technologies, but older doesn't mean worse. It just means different on what we would now use on a greenfield potentially. But nevertheless, I mean, the architecture is sound, and I guess for this kind of problem makes sense to be used, right? And scales quite well development-wise. Okay, so going back. Yep.
Here's a question for you. I suspect our viewers may be wondering something similar. We've seen lots of this sort of thing, the micro front-end approach with the JavaScript frameworks out there. With the advent of Blazor, what do you think the major difference will be in approach, you know, using a JavaScript framework versus Blazor?
The beauty of microfrontends is that there doesn't need to be, let's say, one or the other. All right. So you could combine, let's say, and I have an example here. You could combine parts that have been already maybe implemented in your favorite JavaScript framework or some framework, let's say, with whatever you now want to do in Blazor or you already did. I mean, most of the time that you use different, let's say, technologies is not a question of taste, but rather already developed, let's say, software. So you already have this thing that's working, maybe a player that was already done using, I don't know, React under the hood. And then you maybe have something else, and that was already done with, I don't know, Angular. And you could, of course, now say it would be the best if that all would be one technology underneath. But I mean, you at the end of the day, no user will care about that. Yeah, you just used one technology. But what your company will care about is that you can that you can ship the feature now, right? And then you can still improve and say, oh, okay, performance is not good because we used two frameworks. But giving the path that you can actually do this migration or bring together these two different pieces and have one application that hopefully looks quite seamless too in the end, because that, again, customers will care about. That is, I think, what the beauty is of microfrontends. Plus, of course, now you have then these independent pieces. You can still refactor one piece without impacting the other, right? So you can still then say, oh, I got this one piece. Now that was written in Blazor because there was this awesome library and that would have been so much work implementing it, I don't know, in standard JavaScript or in JavaScript using framework X, I don't know. Now I can just ship it because this library was here and it was in Blazor just a work of 2 days, and then I tested it and then I just shipped it. And I think this is the beauty of that approach. Not to take too much away already, what Blazor does well, I mean, is that you can really mangle it a lot. Problem is you need to mangle it a bit because Blazor itself always assumes that it's the only thing running there. So you need to do a little bit of tricks. We will go into at least a few of them, I guess, in here to make it work in a micro front-end world. And it doesn't work with multiple versions of Blazor because, again, each one thinks it's the only one. They use, for instance, a global variable already to attach to a document object model. All the JavaScript interop, if you know Blazor, works against this one object. So if you would use multiple versions, let's say a 3.2 and a 5.0, good luck with that.
So you've described Blazor as sort of this selfish child that thinks it's the center of the universe and nothing else matters. That's a nice segue into this next question from our audience, and I'll put it up on the screen here. Does this micro front-end approach mean you can have a Blazor app run in some sort of hybrid mode, like a server app with some parts running in WASM?
Theoretically, yes, but I'd argue you wouldn't need micro frontends for this. Of course, it would help because now you would have isolated the different parts. This isomorphic kind of rendering that you can get with Blazor, where you have already the server side generating something for you, and then on the client side, it just gets hydrated and, let's say, made interactive. I guess that already is fine. And what you could do is just, enhance your approach with something like getting your Blazor components from either a NuGet library or somewhere else, which is usually like 80% what you want already. But we can go in there. So it's what I would always call the build-time integration kind of way. The difference to, let's say, standalone components, where I draw the line between what is a microfrontend and what is just a component library, is that a microfrontend would actually know your domain and would, have these domain objects, whereas a component library really just has bare technical components. I mean, they of course some UI component, I don't know, a drop down, a date picker and so on, but it doesn't know anything about your domain or how it's used, right? Whereas a microfrontend, that really is attached now to your use case. But in the end of the day, you could just, have a build-time integration that works. And it's already 80% of the job. The problem, of course, with build-time integration is that you need a build for it. So which means every time that a microfrontend is shipped or updated, somewhere a central big fat CI/CD pipeline needs to be triggered, which now combines all your stuff, even though 90% of it wasn't changed, and ships a new version. But if you can live with that, that's fine. Usually build-time integrations are the easiest to deal with, and but they have.
And when you say
downsides.
Build-time integration, is that the CI/CD pipeline, or are you talking about build tools like Webpack, or I guess could it be both?
Yeah, could be both. So of course a CI/CD pipeline, but then of course using some tool. I mean, if you stay exclusively on Blazor, then it's of course simple because MS Build will be your tool, right? But if we are thinking broader now, then you need a bundler like Webpack anyway for sure. But that is usually part of your CI/CD pipeline. So when your build triggers, then Webpack, for instance, or some other bundler of your choice will do then the hard work and get all these pieces in, optimize it, of course, and then spit out all the different JavaScript, CSS, and so on assets that make your application then really live.
Now let's think of this situation. Let's say I'm a developer that's been tasked with developing a desktop application, and that leads nicely into this next question: is do any of these concepts apply to me if I'm using WPF or UWP? Can I still take this micro front end approach?
I'd say yes. So what we usually do, so that's at least what the framework where I'm also contributing is doing. This framework, again, is called Rappl, is using what I would call a plugin-like approach. And plugin patterns, I mean, every, let's say, larger WinForms, WPF, or UWP application, was equipped with a plugin approach. The only question then is, how powerful can these plugins be, right? So and that usually was a problem because on the one hand, you wanted maybe to have some freedom. On the other side, you didn't want them to, let's say, to let them do everything. So you maybe wanted to sandbox them or whatever. But that problem left aside, this plugin approach has several advantages. And the biggest advantage is if you can still loosely couple them. And what it usually does is, I mean, the main application doesn't know any of these plugins. The plugins now know, let's say, a standardized API, standardized in that sense that it is, let's say, well typed, that you know already what you're dealing with, that you can even maybe version it, right? And therefore counteract maybe, I don't know, conflicts in versioning, etc. And that way you already know what you're doing. So for instance, this approach, what we see here with Netflix, that was done using this plugin approach. So if you would look into one of these microfrontends, so let's pick watch here, the definition of it really is just some metadata, right? Maybe there's a description. There's also a spec, which means specification identifier here. And then we have, and that's the most critical part, the link. This is the real microfrontend. It's just a JavaScript. So that's all. Each microfrontend here is just one JavaScript file. This is the entry file. There may be then more files behind it. But if we look in there, right, I mean, this is now, of course, minified and so on. So it's really ugly code. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to this last section here. And there we see, for instance, a thing like register page. So here we register, well, something. It is, in this case, a React component on this URL here. So whenever we hit watch and then the parameter media type and then the parameter video ID, then this page will be loaded, and it will actually be lazy loaded. We don't see that here, but actually I think we do at some point. There should be a reference, something with .js. Here we see something. So I guess it's this E48 something file that will be loaded whenever we hit this page. And so this register page function or method here came from the API that's actually the interface between now our application shell, or let's say the main application, and the micro frontend. And there may be more such APIs. And you can do the same approach, of course, in the Windows application. There's no problem with that. Of course, the web tooling is quite good these days, and discovery is also very easy on a web server. You would need to, let's say, come up with something here. Discovery may not be the problem. So you could use just a directory where DLLs are placed, right? And via some convention, you find out which ones transport now your fragments. But you could do that, right? This is how the solution here with the Netflix works. So all of these different microfrontends register different, let's say, pages, register also different fragments, like, for instance, for the search or navigation bar in general. And that makes it quite seamless because we have this well-defined API, which can actually then be used to say, oh, and I want another page, or I want a different fragment for this piece. Yeah.
I could see also where with these desktop applications with something like WebView, right? Being able to marry both the web components. So if you already have these micro front ends for JavaScript, Blazor, or whatever it is, and bringing them to desktop applications and sending those applications using these micro front ends, that might be another approach that you might want to take.
That you could also do, of course. So I mean, if your project requires, let's say, or uses already web technology, you can always bring it in via WebView. That's totally possible. Here also, for instance, I mean, if you want to sandbox your things further, you can always also place them in an iframe. I mean, that's also the beauty of it. So you can register a page, and all the page does is loads an iframe with another content in there. That's also not forbidden. So these kind of layerings are also possible. In the end of the day, of course, it all boils down to what's your problem, what's your tool set, and what's the development capacity, and then you try to apply the right thing for it. Right, but yeah, so long story short, I would say it's totally possible. At least we also developed something similar already, let's say like 10 years ago in ASP.NET MVC, where on the server side we were shipping, let's say, something that was very similar to that. Of course, it was all server-side rendered back then, but it did do a DLL discovery, and that product that we shipped there would always depend on what the client, let's say, purchased, and then more or less DLLs were in that set, right? And if there were more DLLs, they were auto-discovered in the beginning. All these DLLs then registered the fragments, and so different parts of the UI were just enriched, right, with more components or whatever was registered then from these, let's call them plugins in this case.
So I'm wondering, we've been looking at JavaScript so far. Is there a Blazor example that you have to share of some of these concepts? Yeah,
so, I mean, at the end of the day, all of that, what I'm going to show in the web is always based on JavaScript, right? The Blazor part then, of course, was used to generate then, the DLLs, which are then hooked up via the WebAssembly, but they always require the JavaScript to be, let's say, seamlessly integrated. The other example that I have that's very similar to the Netflix example, and potentially because it was developed by the same guy, Dante De Ruve again. Can't praise him enough. Just handed in his bachelor thesis on Microfrontends with Blazor.
He's in the audience today, by the way. He chimed in and said something earlier.
Okay, hi Dante. Anyway, he also developed this one, Spiralify. He's a huge user of Spotify, so he thought let's do something with Blazor here. And there was an awesome library in Blazor to actually manage the authentication and the playlists, I guess, of Spotify. And then there was some other library, I think in React, that had a player already for Spotify. So I think I don't have a Spotify account, but you can just check it out. If you log in, you just need to, let's say, have the OAuth authentication done with Spotify, and then it can play your playlists or so. It's a cool thing. And he wrote also an article about that. And the whole code, I think, for this is also on GitHub. And there you can see the Blazor code, actually, which, again, is not let's say, different, because it's just, more or less standard Blazor. The only difference is that, again, you're not writing a standalone application, but your thing is now a microfrontend, which will be hooked on into a larger application. Just check that one out. The other thing, and that may be now the good transition to Blazor, is this static web app. So where I can also show in a brief second how that may look like. It's, let's say, from the technology point of view, very similar to the Netflix one, but visually, of course, you would need now a little bit more imagination. So this is, again, some application shell. When we say application shell, it just means it's, let's say, the index HTML file that transports your basic needs. So some basic style sheets, let's say, basic structure, anything that you say, this is really app generic. Again, if we use the example of the mobile phone, well, this is just the operating system that already comes with a desktop, I don't know, comes with an app launcher, elementary things. But any of the other functionality, that would be transported now in from the microfrontend. So in this case, what it comes with is just this, let's say, banner here. And I think these two links, and then the rest is completely free or up to the microfrontend. So we have here this dashboard where microfrontends can register. So here, for instance, they registered this welcome to Pyral tile. It's a non-functional tile, so really nothing special. And then in this case, we brought in one microfrontend. So if we look at it, it's really just this 107 pilot. I can also show you the code for it in a second. And again, same story as beforehand. So we have some metadata, and then most importantly, we have this link. Now you will say, oh, you told me it's Blazor, but here's just a JS file. Well, if we look at it, you will see that this JS file is actually quite small, could even be smaller, but yeah, it's a lot of gibberish. But at the end of the day, again, all we do is we're calling this API, right? So for instance, we have here an API called register menu, or we have an API called register page. And if we do that, we're calling this from Blazor. So we can't just have a Blazor component in this JavaScript. It actually needs to come from the DLL. And the DLL is actually mentioned here, right? So it actually loads this one DLL, which is here just called Blazor lib-a.
Real quick question, Flo. Now this is of course minified JavaScript, but was this file written by hand or was this generated?
Both. So most of it, I would say, is generated, because it's just the envelope of here, the bundler that was used as parcel. You could use any kind of bundler, like Webpack is another one. So that just generated most of the code. But then what we see down here with the register menu and so on, that was in this case written. However, Dante, I need to mention him again, wrote also some code for Blazor that actually generates these kind of bindings for you. So you actually don't need to, let's say, write any JavaScript for the Blazor part. But if you would write it, and maybe that's a good point in time to open that one. Let me just open the Blazor part. Then we actually, let's say, see how that may look like. Let's see.
What was that, Luis?
It was so this that's writing these register menu and register blade or register page. Is that Pyral doing that, or what are you using?
No, that's at the end of the day, that's the API against your application, but that API, as you said, is driven by Pyral. That's right. So I would say
we did have a question before we navigate away from that source that you're showing. There's a comment up on line 1. This question comes to us from our friend Fuel Snable. At pilot, is that there for attribution purposes, or what's the purpose of that comment on the first line?
Yeah. So what we use in this spiral space or ecosystem is what we've seen is we have this spec v1 in the metadata. So there are different kinds of envelopes you can use. So envelope defines now essentially what is now how this code here is packaged, right? In this case, what we are using is the v1 envelope. And in order for the service, when we upload our pilot, so the service manages and orchestrates these pilots. You can do a lot of things, feature flags, etc. You don't need to have a service, just to mention that, but usually you want to have it because it just makes the solution so much more powerful. Either way, if you upload it, the service needs a way to recognize what kind of envelope you're using. And so this comment is at the top. You could actually drop it now for distributing it. So the client doesn't actually read that comment. So the browser actually will, I mean, it's a comment after all, right? And we are not, let's say, getting the script source and reading the comment again. So then it would be too late already. So it's really just for the server when you upload that thing. And again, you could remove it, but we don't touch that file at all. And so it stays in there. So just to make that, let's say, fully complete, so this is a special marker. It needs to be on top. And then what follows is the version of the envelope. So it's in this case version 1. And then you may have, depending on the version of the envelope, you may have some additional information to share. So in this case, it shares the name of a generated global variable where the shared dependencies, exclusively for this one, Microfrontend lie. And pilot, just for the name, pilot is how we call microfrontends in the spiral world. So one microfrontend there is called a pilot. So it's just a made-up name to signify that's now a tiny thing that you developed there, but it belongs to a larger application shell, and we call it a pilot. So that's why this envelope specifier is called @pilot there. It's just something that usually never occurs.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Right, so that's the reason for this comment. But again, you could also drop it, and depending on your service implementation, or if you have a service at all, you don't need that. But it's auto, so you don't even, I mean, you don't touch this usually. That's done by the tooling. Okay. So I wanted to show you two things. Sorry. Yeah. Great. I don't know. Maybe Visual Studio doesn't know what the TSX extension. No, it does. So the original part of that, let's say, minified JavaScript file that we've seen looks like this. So this is it in this case. That was the original source. That's all. So it was just that one file. And it was part of some demo. So here we got this type here, which is called the pilot API, and describes the shape of this object here from this app shell that we developed. So this is nothing, let's say, generic, but just for this demo. The other part is then here we register tile that is just React component. And here we are actually registering two things from Blazor. And one is the counter menu, so the menu component, and the other is the counter page. And to give that, let's say, some background, this is the menu item counter. Not very spectacular, I know, but this is fully rendered from Blazor. And if we go in here, we now have a counter component that's also coming from Blazor. And to show you the code, I mean, that's a standard example from Blazor. So you've potentially seen that a lot of times, but it doesn't look any different except one tiny thing, and that says, I want to expose this one component also in my pilot, and the name here is counter. So that's how we can refer to it later on. We did here with this from Blazor, and we say, oh, counter. So it knows now where to get it, right? And the same with counter menu, we expose it and give it the name counter minus menu so that we can refer to it later, and that we can say, oh, from our Blazor components, let's pick this one and let's render it. So that's the magic, let's say, happening there.
For each of these components that you're showing, is there any kind of CSS isolation that's being used? In other words, do you have styles that apply just to one specific component? That's what this question is about here.
No. So in this case, not. You could do it theoretically, but we left that intentionally up to the developers, because usually, let's say, at least in the React space, but also a little bit also in other communities like Vue, what is very popular are things like CSS in JavaScript or CSS modules, so approaches that by definition already give you, let's say, scope styling. The rest, I mean, if we would pick now an approach there and say this is it, or we always prefix your CSS modules, it would be already too specific. So what Pyrrell here does is Pyrrell doesn't try to make your microfrontends fully isolated. It doesn't. And that's for good reason. If we would do that, it would potentially work, but it would have significant performance impact. And so we said we want to do something that just enables people to develop that. And if people want to have more isolation, then, I mean, they can still do it on top of Pyrrell, but out of the box, Pyrrell sets the level, let's say, quite minimalistic to still have a very good developer experience, have a good performance, but keep the other things, let's say, open, and therefore choices up to the projects. When we know, of course, that especially if you develop open micro-frontend systems, these are systems where code could be contributed from the outside. I mean, could be still an approval process and so on, but it could come from the outside, right? That some externals say, hey, this is a cool application, I also want to develop something. Yeah, then of course it gets problematic and you need some isolation, but the styling is potentially the least thing you worry about. The JavaScript is more problematic. Things like keyloggers, etc., they can be really done easily, and they shouldn't be underestimated. So if you really develop an open system, then even if we would introduce some isolation, potentially wouldn't be enough. And if you don't develop an open system, then there are other ways to guard it too, right? So linters, for instance, or setting there some guidelines on using CSS modules, for instance.
In using talking a little bit more about styling, this was a question that came up very early from David Pine here, which he asked, curious about the idea of styling with micro frontends. How does a cohesive app define acceptable styling with other micro frontends within the same app? So even though this micro frontend approach, you're sort of letting each team sort of implement their own part of the UI. I would assume that there needs to be some sort of agreement in terms of what that UI should look like and how you're going to, basically keep it consistent across frameworks.
Yeah, this is definitely the case. You need to have this agreement. So this is, let's say, where the social aspect comes in, and that is, in my opinion, stronger than in the microservice case, right? Where really you potentially also had, let's say, some kind of agreement on API styles, etc., that at least that didn't, let's say, feel different from service A to service B. But here, of course, it gets a lot stronger. So what we always recommend is two things. One is use a component library. And of course, if you intend to use different technologies, then this component library should maybe be also really basic. So either use web components in here or really no JavaScript, just CSS only component libraries, because then you're really technology free. But if you know already, for instance, React is your primary framework, you can also accept the React only component framework or component library that you use here. So that's step one. And step two is, of course, now in the hands of the designer. So if designers make, let's say, screen designs that really say, this is it, this is the screen forever, this can't work. And this is the problem we see actually appearing more often. So usually people already use component libraries and they align here and they say, okay, we only use that button from, I don't know, Bootstrap, and that's good, right? So why should you use suddenly your own component library if you see this project already uses Bootstrap, etc.? That's good. But then a designer comes up and says, oh, this is the menu. It has these three items. And there you go. And suddenly you get a new feature request and that says, now add something else to the menu. Maybe that's just really simple, but then maybe a scroll bar appears and maybe the designer didn't really think these scalability things through. And since micro frontend applications tend to be larger, this designer is now occupied on some different feature designing now, well, how the user journey should be in that feature, and it doesn't come back to, let's say, updating now how the menu behavior is, etc. So it really then boils down to already thinking about these edge cases. What happens if there are no elements? What happens with these elements? What's about the ordering? And giving up a little bit of control, but on the other hand, giving out more rules initially, right? So because designers usually don't care about writing down the rules, they just care about giving you screen designs. But that doesn't work so nicely in the micro frontend space if you can scale in every direction, and suddenly it doesn't match anything that was actually wanted. And that's the problem we usually encounter more often. So it's these two sides. One is really agreeing on a set of rules, how things should behave. And that is still a very central aspect. It's this UI consistency you want to uphold. And the other thing is then use some technical foundations. They're like component libraries.
We've got another question here, and this is something I wondered about myself. Assume you need to share some data between the shell application or the parent application and the Blazor component within there. Is that possible? And if so, how would you accomplish that?
Yeah, in general, it is possible. The way here is, of course, again, through JavaScript, because that's the bridge that you have. Of course, if you develop now a Blazor-only micro-frontend solution that already starts with the application shell in Blazor, and each part in Blazor each microfront in Blazor is each microfront is also written in Blazor. Then, of course, you can stay just on the C# level, and everything will be handled there inside your CLR, so to speak, which runs now in WebAssembly in the browser. But coming back to, let's say, general mechanisms. So you can, of course, let's say, share data objects, which, again, through the JS bridge has limitations if you think about Blazor and JavaScript. So you could share these. You can have events. That's a very popular approach. And the third thing, and that's actually what we usually try to advocate a lot, is just use components, right? And that sounds crazy at first, but this is one of the, let's say, core parts of this whole Spiral approach, is not that you have these very specific APIs that you can write your own, like register menu or register page, but you have a very generic API, which is called register extension, and which is short for register extension component. And that allows you to just register a component that will render on a certain name. And that will get the data just from whoever wants to render it. So that's a very loosely coupled way. Do I have it here? Nope. I think Dante has it in his example. We also see that. So Dante also made, of course, a proof of concept. That's now Blazor exclusive solution, but the idea is the same. So here he also uses a very similar approach to these extension components, and that's called Fragments in this case. So what he does is he just uses here a fragment called homepage. So he doesn't care about where this homepage is coming from. If there is no fragment called homepage registered, it's no error, nothing will render here. But you can always just register a fragment called homepage. Now I just need to find it.
If you don't mind, can you zoom in a little bit on your IDE here?
Yeah, we can make it, well, let's make it 200 then. Is it better? Or should we do 250?
I think 200 is sufficient.
Okay.
And then we're also getting questions in the chat about where can we find this source code? Is this available on GitHub somewhere?
Yeah, all of them. So for the proof of concept of Dante's thesis, I can give that out later. The other links I will also give out later. Most of the links you will find also through Spiral, which you can either find on GitHub via smapyot/Spiral, or just using spiral.io, which is the homepage. The other links I will also present then in the chat later. They are all available.
Okay.
I would also encourage everyone to just go to Spiralify party and maybe check out the articles that Dante wrote on Dev2, or check out my articles. There are a lot of articles on microfrontends in general. different patterns to implement them, all the way from build-time composition, server-side composition, client-side composition, which are all different ways to, let's say, structure and realize microfrontends in their benefits and drawbacks.
Question on Pyrol. Does Pyrol include support for any kind of end-to-end testing? You think of solutions like Selenium or Playwright and using those. I wonder how complex that might become if you're using different tech stacks throughout this larger application.
So we don't have any solution, let's say, out of the box, but things like what you just mentioned, Cypress or Selenium or, Nightwatch, anything that space usually works. Pyrol is using this emulator kind of approach, which means you can always start your microfrontend, right? It will run in your browser in this empty app shell. And that is not only for development purposes, but it can also be, of course, used to have end-to-end tests only target now at this one microfrontend, right? That makes it possible. But we don't, let's say, have anything out of the box where we say you need to use this. Maybe it would be something nice to just say you can use this. We don't have it right now. I think we have in one of our guides, we either mention Nightwatch or Cypress and how to set it up. But it's very generic there. It's not different to setting it up for, I don't know, a standard React project or Vue project or whatever. But yeah, would be maybe a good addition to have something out of the box.
And, with that in mind, is there any kind of a public roadmap that folks could see for Pyrol? What's coming in the near future? What
we are using the milestones on GitHub to track this. And in the past, we had, let's say, also a series on Dev2 about what's new. And there we always had, let's say, an outlook. I think we didn't do that in the past half year, but we have a very active GitHub chat. And there we are also discussing always what's upcoming and ideas and so on. All the links for the GitHub chat are also in the repository.
Okay. We've got a question in the chat from our friend Cam Does Cool Stuff. Are there any good books on this topic?
Books. It's good. I mean, there are 3 good books. At least 2 of them are out now. So the latest book that was released is actually from me. So sorry, shameless plug here. It's called The Art of Microfrontends. It was released from Pact. It's out now. It's also very, let's say, technology independent. Yeah, most examples use just vanilla JS. And it goes through different patterns, what's important and what not. And the other book, and that was the first one I think that was out there. I need to find it in my shelf. There it is. That's also a very good book in my opinion. The author is also a great guy. Microfrontends in Action, Michael Gers. That one. I mean, naturally, Michael is focusing more on server-side composition. He works in this space, so a lot of retail, e-commerce applications. And these are, let's say, tailored very well for server-side composition. This book, let's say, tries to advocate the client-side composition a little bit more, but that is in my, let's say, nature.
It was not a shameless plug. I queued you up specifically to plug your book.
Thanks.
So it looks like Pact and Manning are the 2 publishers of those books.
Yeah, and the third one is now O'Reilly is coming up. That I think will be published in late October, start of November. That's out for pre-sale now. So my recommendation is get all 3 books. If you say that's a waste, then just get mine. Or just read the blog post, and if you say, oh, it's not for me, then don't get any book and save the money.
Now, let's assume I don't order the books. By the way, you should. But let's say I don't. Are there any good getting started guides or tutorials that I could find on the Pyrol website?
Yeah, I think there are. So if you go into Pyrol, first of all, you can open this playground, but maybe that's a little bit too esoteric there. But we have a very, let's say, what should I call it? Complete, maybe not complete. You tell us, right? If it's any use to you, kind of tutorial structure in here where we have, of course, let's say first a very generic getting started introduction, but then we really go into all the different concepts. You set up an application shell, you run through the different commands. As you can see, it's really explained in all detail, because at the end of the day, I mean, we try to make it simple, but let's face it, microfrontends are not simple, like microservices are also not simple. They may be simple once they're set up, but this really takes you through that process, right? To set up your own micro front-end solution. And with Spiral in this case, distributed already from the beginning. And yeah, what you need to do there, each of these, let's say, sections here also has a video that goes just through the contents of the one. So if you prefer videos, it's also in video form. If you want to just, let's say, read, you can read it. And yeah, if anything is unclear.
God. Is that a Lego record store?
It is. So it's, I mentioned this feed service, so which you can, of course, develop on your own. But we have one publicly available that you can just use for free. So if you say, oh, I also want to have, let's say, yeah, something where my pilots are, let's say, distributed, you can just use the Spiral Cloud for that. It's a free service, at least for, let's say, private use. And if you need enterprise, let's say, support for that and have a lot of requests going on, then just contact us, because otherwise we will contact you. And this is how it usually goes. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're running out of time for today's show. I want to thank Flo again. Luis, who do we have on next week? Or I guess the next show?
So next week is actually a U.S. holiday, so we won't be here. If you want to join, you can actually watch some of our previous recordings, which are available on the .NET Live TV, as well as, I believe, YouTube. So make sure to check out past recordings. Maybe this one, if you came late, check that out. But in 2 weeks, we'll have a panel of guests talk about IoT, all things IoT, for an Ask Me Anything session. So make sure to tune in, bring your questions, and learn a little bit about IoT.
And so now I'm curious, who can we expect on that IoT panel? Any teasers?
Yeah. So we have Laurent Ellerbach, Jose Rodriguez, and Christoph Weicker, I believe. I hope I did.
Very nice.
That. Yes.
All right, well, that's it for today, folks. Again, thank you for tuning in to the .NET Doc Show. We will see you not next week, but the Monday after. Thank you.
Bye.